Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it's your online social psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. With that said, let's jump into it. Beginning with operationally defining some key terms. Prejudice, defined as a negative attitude toward an individual solely on the basis of that person's presumed membership in a particular group. Stereotypes, overgeneralized beliefs about the traits and attributes of members of a particular group. And discrimination, negative behavior toward an individual solely on the basis of that person's membership in a particular group. So, kind of our three key differences, our three primary action words within these definitions. We have prejudice, attitudes, stereotypes, beliefs, and discrimination, behavior. All right, now let's jump into some more specific examples and elaborate how these operational definitions are embedded in more complex constructs. Our first model of proposed roots of prejudice is from Allport. And Allport proposed that there are prejudice results from hostile feelings linked to a salient category of people, familiarity-based preferences for the in-group over out-groups. This is commonly referred to as in-group bias, and internalized worldview. Now let's walk through three of these basic causes of prejudice according to Allport. Beginning with hostile feelings linked to a category, Allport theorized that basic cause of prejudice is the result of two basic human tendencies. Feelings of hostility arise when one is frustrated, threatened, or witness to unpleasantness or injustice. We routinely categorize people as members of social groups. So stop and tear momentarily. As we talked about throughout this course, people categorize things, objects, and as well as people. So you can imagine you look at a person and you categorize that person as a teenager. And say you had a rough childhood or teenage years or whatever, some kind of negative experience with the riffraff teenagers who live around you. So you look at that person, you say that in milliseconds, you categorize that person as a teenager, and then you basically are linking that category to whatever, your hostility towards that person, that teenager, I should say, or the threat that the teenagers supposedly had. Maybe they bullied you or something along those lines. So you're again connecting that category teenager to this hostile feeling of whatever, threat or just whatever bad experiences, teenagers bad, something like that. However, even without a history of, say, dealing with teenagers, so you had a great teenager experience, or maybe you were homeschooled or something, you just didn't interact with other teenagers, whatever it is. However, despite any specific behaviors of a group, a person can still experience displaced aggression. This is characterized as frustration, which people experience, which can increase negative feelings and actions towards outgroups in the absence of any specific behavior of the outgroup. When white Americans believe resources are scarce, they are more likely to reduce resource allocation to Black Americans, according to a 2019 study. So maybe you do not have direct experience with that category of people doing something, whatever, harmful in your opinion, or that group is actually doing nothing at that moment in time, but maybe the conditions around you, your social environment, can still increase the negative feelings related to the group. So in the context of scarcity, these researchers found that white Americans, again, will reduce resource allocation to Black Americans in the absence of any kind of direct specific behavior that's identified by those white American participants. So something's happening in your social environment, and then you take it out on this whatever category of people you don't like. So thus you're displacing your aggression from this environment around you, in this case, some kind of scarcity, and then placing it on the group that you have a negative evaluation of. Consistent with the previous research outline, some researchers have argued that initial negative between-group feelings are often based on scarce resource conflict or competition. This brings us to the realistic group conflict theory. This theory asserts that the initial negative feelings between groups are based on a real conflict or competition regarding scarce resources. These theorists argue that if individuals in a group think access to land, water, or jobs are being threatened, this can increase the sense of threat and frustration, as well as generate negative feelings about perceived group rivals. Efron and Knowles in 2015 argued people are more likely to express prejudice when they view their own group as having collective interests which are threatened by an outgroup. Negative feelings towards a group are often culturally transmitted through generations, even if the original conflict is no longer pertinent. So these theories build on Allport's three basic causes, specifically, again, hostile feelings linked to a salient category of people. Here we have this realistic group conflicts theory, so kind of breaking down, there's a real group conflict that existed. So these negative feelings between groups can be rooted in some kind of war, military conflicts, political, economic conflict, or something along those lines, some kind of dwindling of resources. Maybe there's, I don't know, some kind of bubonic plague or something like that, which wiped out a lot of people. So kind of the idea here, again, this conflict serving as a catalyst to this feeling of threat and frustration, which then will bring about kind of a negative evaluation of that outgroup. And basically with these, again, these researchers are arguing that when that theoretical military conflict or economic or political conflict ends, people in that group can still maintain the negative viewpoints of the outgroup. These feelings are culturally transmitted through maybe families who are directly involved, something like a community members, maybe there's like memorials or something like that to whatever the war or the conflict. This can be in educational settings or kind of a larger macro kind of culture. But ultimately, these conflicts or this negative group feelings are culturally and socially reproduced across generations, thus increasing the probability of negative attitudes towards whatever the outgroup is, whatever your enemy or something along those lines. Our next example comes from Yam in 2022, who found that during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a threefold increase in verbal and physical attacks directed at Asian Americans. Prejudice and discrimination became predictable consequences of negative feelings linked to a category. So one interpretation of this, according to these theorists, would be that we have this kind of negative feelings associated with COVID, and then kind of a suspected origin of COVID-19 in China, and then linking kind of that possible origin of COVID-19 to those dissatisfaction with going through COVID together, thus increasing negative attitudes towards that group, and then ultimately resulting in increased rates of physical and verbal attacks against Asian Americans. You can also possibly link the idea of scarcity here due to backup in supply chains, kind of the classic COVID panic of grocery stores and all these things of supply chains and people trying to get groceries. So in that context of theoretical scarcity, and also in the context of heightened China and United States tension in kind of a political arena prior to COVID-19. This can kind of set the social environment in which these kind of physical attacks can increase against Asian Americans. So the next cause of prejudice, according to Allport, the tendency to prefer what is familiar over what is unfamiliar. So people have a familiarity-based preference for in-groups over out-groups. The argument is most people like themselves and demonstrate a self-serving bias. Self-esteem derives in part from group membership, and in-group bias serves self-esteem needs. So we have this automatic preference for familiarity, according to Allport, and we also have this self-serving bias. So whatever we're a part of, we want to think that it's good, So therefore, we're going to have this in-group bias. We like us more than other people, and therefore could have increased the probability of prejudice towards out-group members due to the preference of our group. Now, attempting to interpret these in-group biases through the social identity theory, which argues that self-esteem is derived from our group memberships, and as such, kind of the thought process here is that the group is great because I'm in it, and I am great because I am in the group. So you gain self-esteem by thinking highly of your group, as well as thinking poorer or just less highly than the out group. So again, Allport arguing that we have in-group bias, which is one of the causations of Prejudice. We have social identity theory, kind of encapsulating this, or one way and one lens in which you can find support for this argument of Allport. We're in, again, self-esteem. We're getting self-esteem from being in our group, and we're also saying, and then kind of in the process, we're saying this group is awesome because I'm a member of this group, and I am great because I am part of this group. So you're getting self-esteem from being a part of that group, and also theoretically, consequently, you have a higher probability of saying, well, other people obviously aren't in my group, so therefore they're less than me. So I can gain self-esteem by kind of propping myself up and then diminishing other people. Another example of self-esteem protecting prejudice is scapegoating. Scapegoating is defined as, or kind of an example of scapegoating is when people feel inferior, guilty, anxious, or unsuccessful, they can often blame an outgroup for their troubles. It reminds people of the threat of natural disasters, with increase in viewing outgroups as enemies with evil intention. So a person who's a member of a group, you're feeling anxious, you're feeling inferior for whatever reason, and you do not want to blame yourself. You have issues going on in your life, you have your own problems. However, you don't want to blame yourself, so you scapegoat, you blame another group of people. This allows you to kind of psychologically gain control of your life, according to some scholars. Because now you have preserved your self-esteem because it's not your fault. And however, you've identified the culprit, and therefore, whatever, you can take control back of your life by confronting them or just blaming them, whatever form it is. In the research from Landau in 2012, one interpretation is that in the context of a natural disaster, so you're anxious about whatever, hurricane, earthquake, whatever, wiping out your city. You are ultimately under threat from that natural disaster. In that context, the researchers found that threat of natural disasters being positively associated with an increase of viewing outgroups as enemies with evil intention. So who's to blame for this hurricane and whatever? Maybe they created the hurricane, or maybe the hurricane recovery was poor because whatever, say that happens, you have a poor hurricane recovery, poor evacuation plan, or the presence of more hurricanes than what you thought. Okay, well, what's the reason for this? Well, what you can do is blame all those troubles, whatever they are, these systematic issues, on an out group. And in the context of a natural disaster, well, killing a bunch of people, well, wow, that outgroup must be really evil because they're creating the hurricane and or ruining our evacuation plans and or just messing up the preparations required for the natural disaster. There is variability in in-group bias research. So, for example, in-group bias may not occur when people can make research allocations in private rather in front of group members. Collectivist cultures / cultures that emphasize or value equality have been found to show decreased levels of in-group bias. So if you're able to select how you want resources to be allocated in private, researchers have found that there's a decreased level of in-group bias, aka kind of just hoarding the resources for your in-group. And in cultures that are less individualistic and or value equality, they are less likely to demonstrate in-group bias in research. Again, kind of demonstrating the need for kind of cross-cultural research across countries and cultures and whatever different economic, political, moral norms and different values, because they can impact the results of these findings, and thus be cautious when kind of drawing universal conclusions from kind of largely college students sampled in the United States. All right, in Allport's third basic cause of prejudice is this idea that we all exist in a culture. We're all taught what is right and good behavior. We all have some cultural worldviews. This brings us to ethnocentrism, which is defined as viewing the world through our own cultural value system and thereby judging actions and people based on our own culture's views of right and wrong and good and bad. Conforming to the norms and values of one's worldview can contribute or lead to a prejudice, according to Allport. Because worldviews determine our views of what is right and wrong, others are often judged on the basis of those cultural values. So culture A has certain values, certain norms, certain understandings of how the world works, and those are not universally consistent. In response to that inconsistency, members of country A, for example, can develop prejudice against country B with different cultural value systems. And kind of the idea here is that a person's cultural value system, a person can believe, okay, well, this is universal, this is the right, this is universally correct across all time, and therefore I'm going to judge all people's actions across all of the world, across all of history, through my specific cultural beliefs and values. And because they're not going to be universally consistent, you can develop prejudice. Cultural worldviews may also explicitly disparage particular groups, or it may implicitly disparage them by prioritizing certain values and goals. We internalize values and norms. Countries that endorse collectivist values of family harmony show less bias against older adults than nations that value individual achievement, according to a study in 2021. So basically, as we age, we internalize those values and norms that are taught to us through whatever families, schools, institutions we interact with, just interacting in the social world. We encounter these values and norms, and then we internalize them. And again, we can then use those values and norms that we internalize to evaluate the social world around us. Now, those values and norms are often not just kind of neutral, but can explicitly disparage against particular groups. So, for example, in the Deep South in the U.S. in the 1950s, Jim Crow era, we have norms and values consistent with those kind of greater institutions of Jim Crow. And for people unfamiliar with this, kind of global definition here is just kind of legalized racial segregation. So in this context, we have norms, institutions, values, the political economic systems, institutions based in kind of that segregation. And kind of related to those institutions, when you have those institutions, values and norms will emerge in that social developmental context that are consistent with those institutions. And then as such, people who conform and kind of accept those values and norms in the context of the Deep South in the 1950s were more likely to be prejudiced than people who had low levels of conformity. Because in this context, conformity is literally conformity with kind of Jim Crow institutions, values and norms consistent with racial segregation. So in this case here, we are internalizing values and norms, again, consistent with Jim Crow, and then we behave within the, or I should say behave in ways consistent with those kinds of values and norms. And we also develop beliefs consistent with those values and norms within that historical developmental context. And thus contributing to a greater probability of prejudice when you conform to those values and norms. All right, leaving behind Allport's model of prejudice and moving on to our next construct, symbolic racism. This is operationally defined as a tendency to express negative biases held about a racial outgroup, not at the group directly, but at social policies seen as benefiting that group. People who, or I should say researchers, who leverage this construct argue that many white Americans internalize quote-unquote traditional conservative Eurocentric moral values and view Black Americans as a threat to the quote American way of life. For example, high in symbolic racism may feel, or I should say people who are high in symbolic racism may feel justified in opposing social programs and support decrease of civil liberties for certain groups. According to a 2006 study, a high symbolic racism was positively associated with anti-crime policies, including the death penalty and three-strike laws. So here again, the idea is that a group has a certain, again, kind of worldview, and some groups are not going to kind of be representative or kind of be antithetical to that worldview. Here, we're applying it to the realm of racial groups. Now, here we have negative biases, not directly kind of applied to that group, but rather, again, kind of social policies that are thought to be correlated with a particular racial group. So maybe something like free lunches or something like that, whatever social welfare program. So kind of the idea here is you have this bias towards this outgroup who are not consistent with your worldviews. They're threatening your way of life. And as such, one way that You can kind of beat back people who are inconsistent with your worldviews. How that quote unquote group acts is to oppose policies that you believe are kind of designed just to impact that racial out group. So again, social policies, for example, you're not directly saying, "Oh, I don't like this," or "I don't like X racial group." Rather, you're saying, "I oppose Y social program because it's helping that social group." You're not saying that kind of second part, that because it's helping that racial group, but you're just opposing that social program, and with kind of the implicit or explicit understanding or viewpoint that social program is going to, again, disproportionately impact that racial group, and you believe that they don't deserve that because they're in violation of some kind of like worldview that you have. So again, point being here, you're not directly stating you're against that racial outgroup, but rather kind of indirectly opposing policies or programs, whatever it is, that a person believes is going to directly benefit said group. Or you can support a specific policy. So you have high symbolic racism. This 2006 study, these participants who were found to have high symbolic racism positively associated with anti-crime policies. So policies, again, that this group believes will like punish that racial outgroup more. So death penalty, for example, or three-strike laws. If you're not familiar with three-strike laws, there's different versions of it. Basically, it's like a baseball analogy here. You get 3 misdemeanors or something along those lines, and on the third, like arrest or whatever it is, you get like a mega penalty. Like it turns into a felony, and you're in jail for some amount of years, something like that. So in this case here, you have high levels of symbolic racism, and as such, you are going to support policies that you believe directly impact a racial group that you have a negative evaluation of. All right, so then you can counter it, this interpretation, say, okay, or whatever, just add to it in kind of general discussion, like, okay, well, why don't people just like say everybody do whatever it is that they want, it's all good, different strokes, different folks, whatever that kind of phrase is. Well, terror management theory provides an explanation. Terror management theory is operationally defined, or I should say in this case, argues that people must sustain faith in the validity of their own cultural worldview so that they can continue to offer psychological security in the face of our personal vulnerability and mortality. So kind of the argument here is that we need these cultural worldviews because they give us psychological security. We all know we're going to die. We have this vulnerability. We have our mortality, a ticking time bomb of death coming for us all. So culture allows us to say, like, okay, so maybe I'm part of something bigger than myself. The world, my legacy, my worldviews will continue on. Well, the presence of other cultural worldviews who have theoretically opposite or radically different cultural worldviews kind of challenge that assumption. That is, the world can continue on without me when I am dead. And not only that, but the world can continue on with a kind of value framework or cultural worldview that's completely different from my own. The world does not depend on my cultural framework to kind of carry on a whole host. And then as such, I'm kind of losing kind of that security that my cultural worldview is correct and that to adhere to it is kind of consistent with like this universal truth. And thus, that's what kind of allows me to continue on in my legacy or something throughout time. So kind of considering this idea, the general hypothesis of these kind of scholars is that raising problems of mortality makes people more positive towards others who support their worldviews and more negative to others who implicitly / explicitly challenge it. So again, that group is, by their very existence, they have different cultures from me and therefore they represent kind of a threat to the or I should say kind of like as a reminder that the world can, again, continue to exist without my specific cultural worldview. And as such, when I'm facing my own mortality, where I'm thinking about death, I'm going to cling on to my worldview, my cultural worldview, even more stringently. So therefore, I'm also going to be more positive towards people who share my worldview and more negative to people who challenge my worldview in order to maintain my psychological security. So, for example, a 2005 study found that reminders of mortality increased prejudice against physically disabled individuals, possibly because they reminded people of their own physical vulnerabilities. And in this case here, I'm reminded of my mortality in some way, and then researchers found that there is an increased prejudice towards people with physical disabilities. So in that case, maybe that person being physically disabled is kind of like a reminder that of your own mortality. That because ultimately, spoiler, every single person will become disabled, and thus, especially among American college students, kind of the idea is that, well, you don't get to live forever. You are not mortal. So that person, these physically disabled people, are like real world reminders, physical manifestations of my incoming death is kind of the interpretation here. Self-reported conservative U.S. students were more likely to support preemptive bombing countries regardless of collateral damage, when reminded of their own mortality. So again, here we have, I'm reminded of my own death. And maybe I also have pre-existing worldviews that specific countries have different cultural values than ours, and they're out to like kill us all or something along those lines. So in this case here, I am threatened by, I'm bringing my mortality is more salient in my mind. I'm thinking about my death, and what we're going to do, and my reaction to this is to attack violently other cultures that can challenge that worldview or theoretically represent a threat to my worldview. So in this case here, bombing other countries regardless of the collateral damage that may occur. And also keeping in mind kind of the social context in which this occurs, kind of creeping towards the end of the 21st century, Afghanistan and Iraq wars. Canadian Christians reminded of death were better able to avoid thoughts of their own death if they imagine Muslims dying in a car crash, according to a 2008 study. So here we have your worldview, or I should say, again, your mortality is brought salient to your mind. You're thinking about your own death. And participants are given the choice to imagine the death of people who do not are theoretically inconsistent with their own worldviews, according to the participants. So different religion, for example. So members of that religion dying can, in this research results found that thinking about the death of other religious members kind of decreasing your thoughts of your own death. So again, eliminating people who theoretically explicitly challenge your worldviews. Now, it's important to keep in mind that they don't actually have to explicitly challenge your worldviews, but a person has to believe they do so, and therefore, if they believe that outgroup explicitly challenges their worldviews, eliminating implicitly or directly those people of those outgroups can decrease your sense of mortality, because now you're more psychologically secure. You have eliminated people who are coming for you or from your culture, and with that threat eliminated, your legacy, your culture can theoretically live forever or something like that. So now you're back to being part of something that's bigger than yourselves, and something that is sustainable. Now let's just discuss personality predictors of prejudice. Some people are more prone to being prejudiced and using stereotypes than others. People who tend to be prejudiced against one outgroup also tends to be prejudiced against other outgroups, according to a 2018 study. So kind of the idea here is that in general, people who are very prejudiced against one group, they're not like, okay, well, that's the only group that I don't like. Those people who have high rates of prejudice against one group have a higher probability of being prejudiced against a second or multiple outgroups. Next, we have this construct called the authoritarian personality. This personality is described as uncritical acceptance of authority, preference for power arrangements in society, adherence to convention, and a tendency to think in black and white terms. So just briefly kind of going over this, kind of the idea here, you can almost think kind of like authoritarian parenting, kind of something like that, or just general pop culture understanding with authoritarianism. The idea that you uncritically accept of everything from authority figure. If authority figure tells you something, then it's 100% correct. Just accept it. There should be kind of a rigid power arrangements, kind of like hierarchical arrangements that exist for a reason. You're going to follow your norms and values, those social conventions, conventions strictly because, again, you're kind of uncritical acceptance, and you think about the world in black and white terms, so good or bad. So you follow the rules or you don't follow the rules. People who don't follow the rules are bad, and therefore whatever, something needs to be done about them. Next, we have the right-wing authoritarianism, RWA. This kind of construct and this ideology holds that the social world is inherently dangerous and that maintaining security requires upholding society's order and tradition. People with high RWA is positively associated with higher rates of dislike for socially, quote, deviant groups that threaten, quote, traditional norms such as LGBTQ plus people. You see this measured a lot in kind of political psychology journals as well. And again, kind of the idea here is that we have the world is dangerous. It's inherently, like automatically, essentially always a dangerous world. And as such, we need to be like kind of high security. We have to, again, kind of accept authority figures. And we also have to uphold these like our quote unquote traditions, because those traditions allow us to make sense of the world and kind of keep us safe. Now, obviously, what is the tradition is always going to be debated through time, through kind of different political and economic ideologies. But ultimately, kind of groups that are seen as kind of, again, quote unquote, deviant in their behavior, challenging these traditional norms as defined by right-wing or participants with right-wing authoritarianism. Again, they're kind of those, their appearance, their behavior, whatever it is, are challenging those norms, those traditions, and as such, putting us at greater risk of danger from the world around us. They are threatening the social order that keeps us safe in this kind of highly unpredictable and dangerous world. Next, we have social dominance orientation, also known as SDO. This is an ideology in which the world is viewed as a ruthlessly competitive jungle where it is appropriate and right for powerful groups to dominate weaker ones. Some people/groups are just better than others, so society should be structured hierarchically, with some individuals/groups having higher social/economic status than others. Predicts prejudice against physically disabled, unemployed, and lower class people, according to a 2007 study. And many of these constructs are going to be correlated. So again, we have this worldview that the world is competitive, it's ruthless, it's a jungle out there kind of thing, it's dangerous. And therefore, to maintain our safety, we must have kind of this hierarchical arrangement wherein we have powerful groups. And not only that, it's correct for the powerful groups to dominate the weaker ones because the people at the top, the group, individuals, whatever it is, are just point blank essentially better than other people. So you believe that there should be people at the top, whatever group it is, and because they deserve to be there. And as such, because they deserve to be there, all society should be kind of structured around this hierarchical notion that X group, ABC group people are at the top. Again, they deserve to be there, so we have to structure our society around that. And in practice, that means that people at the top should have greater social status, greater wealth, greater control of whatever, the country, whatever region, whatever it is. So we have to survive. It's ruthlessly brutal out there, and some people deserve to be at the top. And those people at the top also kind of serve as kind of like guardians or something along those lines. You need a dominant person in charge to kind of keep the world to the extent that it can be under control, or just like all hell breaks loose. Thus, kind of like the orientation kind of justifies and it kind of gives a theoretical credence to the idea of unequal hierarchies. They are by definition, unequal is by definition good. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see some ways in which you can measure, or one scale in which that measures SDO. So kind of looking at where we stand today with prejudice, segregation is against the law in the United States now, but society is still quite segregated. People often still cluster socially by race and ethnicity. Researchers in 2011 found evidence suggesting that racial and class segregation have increased and or are higher than the previous generation of U.S. Americans. Even as attitudes towards some groups become more favorable, attitudes towards other groups become less favorable as a function of social and political context. For example, 43% of U.S. Americans self-reported having at least some prejudice toward Muslims, according to a 2010 Gallup study. So kind of stopping there for a second, kind of the idea here is this: yes, prejudice and can decrease for particular groups, but that does not mean that it universally goes down for all groups. In specific social and political contexts, other groups can experience an increase in prejudice attitudes against them. So Islamophobia, for example, numerous research has found that rates of Islamophobia and prejudice against Muslims increased throughout the 2000s and 2010s. And kind of zooming out, the political context of being kind of the global war on terror, for example. So whatever, the broadly stated Iraq-Afghanistan war. And in this context, Muslims can be perceived as more threatening or something along those lines. And you can even incorporate terror management theory here. So kind of the idea here is one interpretation of these Afghanistan and Iraq wars of the 21st century is like, oh, we're in kind of this like global war. I should say the United States is in this global war against Muslims or something along those lines. There's the classic clash of civilizations for our political science has out there. That interpretation floating around. Therefore, there should be, according to this interpretation, they're threatening my worldview where the United States is literally at war with them. Therefore, I have an increased probability of feeling some prejudice towards Muslims because, again, literally they are that worldview, Islam, impacting my the U.S.-based cultural worldview is. So again, kind of demonstrating how political and social context, institutions, these things can impact individual behaviors and viewpoints, aka prejudice towards Muslims in this research. Researchers have also found that there are still rates of institutional discrimination. This can be operationally defined as unfair restrictions on opportunities for certain groups of people through institutional policies, structural power relations, and formal laws. Less economic value in paid, traditionally, quote-unquote, women-held occupations, for example. Racial discrimination has been found in housing, credit markets, and consumer pricing in a 2008 study. Also, when American Black defendants are convicted, the more a Black male has, quote, Afrocentric facial features, the harsher their prison sentences for the same crime tend to be, according to a 2017 study. Moreover, Black American defendants who are convicted are more likely to receive a death penalty when the victim was white, according to a 2006 study. So kind of the idea of this defendant finding is that white Americans have stereotypes of how Black Americans look, and when a Black defendant meets those Black stereotypes, those stereotypes become salient in white prosecutors or white juries, white American juries, cognitive processes. And now those white jurors can kind of act on those stereotypes. So punish that defendant more harshly because you just use whatever Black stereotype you would like, some perceived level of violence or something essential to that racial group. And therefore they kind of, that defendant as a representative of that racial group needs to be punished or something along those lines. And kind of the idea here is that those stereotypes are embedded within structural power relations, for example, meaning that historically Black Americans are kind of at a lower level in the hierarchy of social power and social prestige than white Americans. And those kind of get embedded within structural powers, laws, and policies through time, is the interpretation of this 2017 study. So although it's not necessarily directly like a explicitly racist law, kind of the idea is that those structural relations kind of get embedded into, again, kind of policies and laws informally through time. And consequently impact racial groups, religious groups, genders, sexualities, whatever, at lower levels of that kind of social and economic hierarchy. Okay, moving on to implicit prejudice, we will operationally define this as negative attitudes or affective reactions associated with an outgroup for which the individual has little or no conscious awareness and which can be automatically activated in intergroup encounters. In English, basically the idea here is that people can have implicit prejudice, basically prejudice that they have little or no awareness of, and these kind of unconscious or limited conscious prejudice can be activated during certain social circumstances or an experimental setting. How is implicit prejudice measured? Physiologically, by indexing immediate physiological reaction to a person or group. Through cognitive measures of implicit bias, this is the implicit association test. This is kind of the well-known test that people usually talk about or refer to when they're talking about implicit prejudice. And we will cover that momentarily in more depth. The seminal study is based on Fazio in 1995. It might be Fazio. I apologize if you're listening. Fazio hypothesized that if white Americans experience an automatic negative reaction to Black Americans, then exposure to photographs of Black Americans should speed up evaluations of negative words and slow evaluation of positive words. The researchers found that for many white participants, being primed with Black faces sped up reactions to negative words. However, other white participants did not show this pattern. Some showed the opposite. White American participants were found in a 2014 study to have a strong racial bias, or who had a strong racial bias, I should say, had higher levels of amygdala responses when viewing Black American men. Amygdala, just kind of broadly stated, crudely stated, associated with like fear processing, neurologically speaking. Again, broadly stated. However, when given more time, initial negative attitudes tends to get downregulated by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, according to a 2012 study. Okay, so working through these physiological measures and kind of one highlighting this amygdala study, again, kind of the idea here is that white American participants who were found to have strong racial biases also had higher amygdala responses, greater amygdala activation when viewing Black American men, aka theoretically a neurological marker of fear in response to viewing a Black American man. And the key part of these implicit measures, and we'll talk about this more with the IAT measure, is that these are very quick responses. You want kind of this initial kind of like almost like reflex kind of situation. Not exactly, but whatever. Very, very quick, unconscious / little conscious processing of your reaction. That's kind of the idea, implicit prejudice. Again, little or no conscious awareness. Now, interestingly, when given more time, so more conscious kind of reflection, these kind of negative attitudes, it can decrease, aka downregulated by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Again, for our neural nerds out there, dorsolateral meaning basically a location within the brain where the prefrontal cortex is, or the specific part of the prefrontal cortex, I should say. Because there's not specifically, I know in pop psychology, we just say prefrontal cortex, but that's really not how it works. There's specific parts of every part of the brain that that are more active during particular tasks, broadly and crudely stated. So this is basically some evidence that says upon like kind of like reflection, or it can be interpreted as, I should say, that on greater reflection, a little more downtime or a little more time to consciously think through these beliefs and these attitudes, participants say, that's not right. I'm gonna override that, basically, that quote unquote kind of quick automatic processing of racial bias. And as such, kind of decrease that racial bias / negative attitudes towards whatever racial group, in this case, Black American men. Which we can circle back around to that Fazio study, wherein Fazio found that white participants, while being primed with Black faces, they sped up their reaction to negative words. So basically what these researchers are going to do is they're going to briefly, very, very briefly, show a face of a Black person or a white person. And then that'll go away, again, very quickly, so you don't have time to consciously process the face. And then the researchers will show a positive word or a negative word. So the positive word, for example, will be wonderful, and the negative word would be annoying. And you tell the participant to press the button for good if you think the word is good, whatever. So is wonderful associated with good, or you have a second button for the participant is associated with bad. So is wonderful associated with bad or good? And you press whichever button it is as quickly as possible, or conversely, annoying. So again, you can show white face very, very briefly, then the word annoying, and then you tell the participant, all right, now select whether the word annoying is good or bad as quickly as possible. And again, what the researchers found was that among the white participants, or some of many white participants, being the priming with a black face sped up reactions to negative words. However, this was not universal, and actually some white participants found the opposite. But this is kind of the general idea of the IAT. This, again, quick flashes of a face that you don't have cognitively time to process, and then a word, and then you have to press good or bad as quickly as possible. Again, you do not want participants to consciously think about this, because implicit prejudice and is kind of, again, a measurement of limited to no conscious evaluation of an attitude, in this case, prejudice. And some more recent publications that are based on these IAT results come from Charlesworth and Banerjee in 2019, that found in 2015 that 48% of white participants and 42% of biracial participants showed a slight bias towards white faces, while 45% of black adults showed at least slight bias towards black faces. And then the question comes, what the hell does IAT mean? What do these results mean? Because this is very important psychology, not just for this construct, but this is a good demonstration of it. But all of psychology research is, what do these results mean? This is not like arithmetic where 1 + 1 = 2. That is not, in generally, how statistics works. Statistics is kind of an art form. You have to interpret what these results mean. That's why there are different schools of thought, because there are different interpretations of what these, again, any set of results mean. Thus, you need to be careful with your scientific writing. And you will notice when reading scientific articles, researchers are very careful about how they phrase things, generally never writing the word cause, for example. And this is especially important when kind of discussing very, very big constructs of, like, why does racism exist in the world? Why does prejudice exist in the world? How is it maintained? How is it reproduced across generations? Where does it come from? Whatever. Again, why does it happen? These are gigantic questions, okay? And like one argument or one interpretation of some reason why it occurs, there's going to be, again, different schools of thought of, like, all racism all occurs because of implicit prejudice or something along those lines. And then some people say, it's a little bit of the reason why. And then, again, not only that, but where does implicit prejudice, racism, come from? So with that said, let's kind of work through some of the arguments here. So Franz in 2004 found that people show stronger racial biases when they know measures, when it measures, or the task, I should say, measures racial biases. So maybe anxiety about knowing that this task is thought to measure some kind of a racial bias can decrease performance on the task. So although you think you're measuring something implicit, unconscious, there is still conscious awareness that this is measuring implicit prejudice or some kind of racial bias, and therefore it's going to impact the results. The association between, quote, black and quote, bad can be interpreted in multiple ways. Understanding of Black Americans are mistreated, or a knowledge of cultural stereotypes which may not represent personal attitudes, according to a 2012 study. So the question is, if there, you find an association between black faces and quote unquote things like the bad category or something along those lines, how do you interpret that? One way you can interpret this, according to these 2012 researchers, is that it just represents an understanding of a person that Black Americans have historically been mistreated, and they just have general knowledge of cultural stereotypes. In general, kind of broad cultural stereotypes are understood by all members of a given culture. They exist. You can agree with them or not agree with them, but most people know about them. So this kind of implicit association could be kind of representative of that kind of a general knowledge about these cultural stereotypes, and not necessarily personal attitudes. So it's basically, so one way you can interpret this is a measurement problem. Like you're debating basically what it is they're actually measuring. Are you measuring that person's individual or, whatever, some kind of collective personal individual personal attitudes, or are you measuring kind of like a collective or personal understanding of these kind of collective stereotypes that exist. And disentangling those two can be challenging. Payne kind of similarly argued in 2017 that implicit associations are measuring biases of cultural context more than individual mind. So here, this is almost kind of taking a macro perspective for our Bronfenbrenner developmental psychologist heads out there. And so as such, kind of one way to interpret the IAT results is that really what you are measuring is kind of the cultural context of bias. Maybe those institutional discriminations kind of that we talked about before. Those institutions, again, don't just exist in the sky. They, embedded in those institutions are certain understandings of the world. And those understandings of the world shape people's understandings of the world as well. So what you're actually measuring, according to some of this argument, is that these kind of macro institutions, maybe the political systems, the economic systems, the cultural values, those are or I should say, as such, really, again, you're measuring cultural context. And again, this just doesn't matter. This also matters because the ultimately, theoretically, the point of this research is to say, okay, what do you do about this? How do you address them? And so you can think of this as very, very personally, these unconscious things that like just drive our behavior. And now, where does that come from? Is also a debate. Or are these IATs more reflection of these cultural contexts, these institutions, these political, economic, historical conditions that exist that then, again, shape kind of human or citizens of that country's automatic processes. And as such, you target different things. It calls into question, is employee kind of discrimination videos or something along those lines. Through time, if everybody watched those for, 20 years, would Prejudice, would that be removed or something along those lines, or significantly decrease? Or should you challenge some kind of cultural values, economic, political systems, or something like that? And then also, if, it's kind of restating that 2012 study that found the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex can downregulate those initial negative attitudes, then maybe the question is, okay, well, how do you possibly circumvent these implicit attitudes that exist within a particular culture, within a theoretically particular political, economic, and historical context, sets of systems? How do you provide people with the conscious cognitive tools to combat that or something along those lines? And how do you do that on a population level? So these are massive questions. So that's why kind of these interpretations and these debates, one of many reasons why they matter. All right, moving on to stereotyping. We're operationally defining this as a cognitive schema containing all knowledge about and associations with a social group. Some stereotypes are positive, but positive stereotyping can still have negative effects. Now, where do stereotypes come from? Let's talk about some of the debates. There's a cultural perspective. These kind of theorists point to that small children often grasp prevailing stereotypes in a culture. Stereotypes are fundamentally tied to our culture. And then obviously there's a debate on where culture it comes from. In 1989, Devin pointed out that people who don't endorse or actively believe in stereotypes about ethnic groups can still report what the cultural stereotypes are. Another kind of research from 2008 also kind of points to, in kind of support of this cultural perspective argument, that people who watch more news programming are more likely to perceive Black and Latino Americans as more violent and poor. So stereotypes are fundamentally tied to our culture. They're in our cultural systems, they're within our values, they're within our norms, they're within our institutions. Now, where do cultures come from is a whole separate debate. We don't have time to be here. We don't need a 4-hour lecture. And evidence of kind of this cultural perspective is that young children, so 3, 4-year-old, 2-year-old, kind of demonstrating an understanding on some level of these prominent stereotypes. Now, most likely, that kid is not walking the streets. This 2-year-old is not walking the streets, and probably does not have a very complex view of the entire world. Probably not well read, those toddlers. So instead, what it probably is that rather the children are kind of internalizing stereotypes in their culture, at least kind of increasing or demonstrating an understanding of that stereotype. And culture can be transmitted in multiple ways. One of ways is through television, and specifically the news, for example. So one way in which Black and Latino American stereotypes can be transmitted to people, again, is through watching television and news programming. Again, this 2008 study finding that the more participants watched news programming, the more likely they were to perceive Black and Latino people as violent and poor. So kind of the news acting as a cultural mechanism in which we are kind of socialized with different cultural values and specifically cultural views on different groups, and as such kind of a stereotype. Next in our debate, we have the kernel of truth hypothesis, bringing back our old friend Allport. Allport argued that even in cases in which there is a kernel of truth, the stereotype leads to an unjustified jump beyond descriptive differences to assumptions about essential differences in traits and abilities. So kind of the idea here is that, yes, there can be differences in racial, sexual, age, gender, whatever. Differences in social groups can exist in the real world, obviously. But kind of the idea here is that people can interpret or look at that kernel of truth, those differences, and then jump to the conclusion that those differences are essential to the characteristics of that group. So it's kind of the idea that there's differences, and there's differences for a reason. And the reason is because XYZ group is inferior in some way. It is essential to that group. That is why they're different. That is why some groups are lower than others. It is just like a property of them. It is their DNA. Then there's nothing you can kind of do about it. So you basically look at the real world, you see differences, and then you use that quote unquote kernel of truth, and then jump and then to assume that the reason why, or interpret those differences as the reason why there are differences is because, again, it's essential differences in traits and abilities of different groups. Now, interestingly, researchers in a 2005 study assessed personalities from 49 different countries, and there was reasonable agreement across countries about what other nationalities were like. For example, Italians, Germans, and Canadians. So basically, you poll these 49 countries and you say, what are Italians like? Whatever. They're nice or whatever, or they're bad, whatever it is. And there was a reasonable agreement across different countries about what other nationalities were like. However, the researchers found that there was no correlation between the stereotypes and the personalities of people from different countries. So, interestingly, there was kind of some correlation between the stereotypes about what other nationalities were like, but the stereotypes themselves were not correlated with the personalities of people from those countries. In most countries, minority groups that are economically disadvantaged and targets of discriminations are more likely to be arrested. These stereotypical, quote, facts do not necessarily imply any real difference in underlying traits or innate abilities. Research suggests that attributing negative attributes to genetic differences increases prejudice, according to Suhei in 2017. Okay, so kind of the idea here is that across countries, a fairly common finding is that the most disadvantaged groups are also more likely to be arrested. And then there's a whole sociology of criminology. We can't get to in this class. We'd be here all day. But kind of a more or less universal, cautiously universal finding is that, again, economic disadvantaged groups are more likely to encounter law enforcement. And then our last kind of 2 bullet points here is kind of similar to the kernel truth understanding, in that, again, there are differences in whatever outcomes across social groups. But then the question is, again, how do you interpret those differences? What do they mean? And they do not mean necessarily that there are innate differences, that they are essential to those groups themselves. And interestingly, research has found that people who believe that those differences are genetically based, so XYZ, racial group, ethnic group, sexual minority group, whatever, they are different. They are lower in the hierarchy because of their genes. It is essential who they are that increases, that is associated with an increased level of prejudice. Because, kind of piecing this together, one interpretation is like, well, that's kind of fundamental who they are. That gender is lower in the social hierarchy because of genetics. There's nothing you can do about it. As such, their place in the society is just, And in fact, I am correct to hold kind of negative attitudes towards that group to increase my prejudice because it's based in kind of like, now it's based in like science or whatever along those lines. I now have an explanation that is quote unquote objective. It is rooted in the facts, and therefore I have increased level of prejudice, and I'm justified in doing so. Next, we have the social role theory. These theorists argue that stereotypes come from roles and behaviors that societal pressures may impose on a particular group. It's argued because of the fundamental attribution error. When people see us in a role, they conclude we have traits implied by the behaviors we enact in that role. We infer stereotypes at people that describe who people are from the roles that we see people play. Stereotypes attached to groups are often a function of historical, political, economic, and/or culturally embedded social constraints. These systems can increase the probability of roles in which groups work/live, and differences in stereotypes follow suit. For example, African slaves were characterized as ignorant. So again, kind of the idea here is that we have roles in society, all right? And stereotypes derive from those roles and behaviors that certain groups are more likely to inhabit in a particular space and time, or in a specific historical era. So certain groups are more likely to work in basically certain jobs in specific historical eras, for example. So, for example, prior to like 1900, the 20th century, women were far less likely to attend university and far less likely to be a doctor, for example, basically just de facto banned from those jobs. And as such, they were more likely to not, they were 0% chance they're going to be a doctor, broadly stated, and then, but much more likely to have a caregiving job. So thus, women are more likely, or a 19th century woman is more likely to have kind of a caregiving job. And from that kind of increased likelihood, that probability of their role, their job in society, stereotypes can derive. So for example, say again, it's like 1890 and you're like, oh, you look around, you're like, oh, there are no women doctors around here. Well, not a lot of women university students. Therefore, and then stereotype can emerge. So you can say, therefore, they're not in those jobs. They're not doctors because they do not take initiative enough. They don't have rational thought at the same level as men. They are far more communal, so therefore they can't have that doctor job. It's too much pressure. Their feminine nature will just collapse or something if they have that job. So basically what we're doing here is, again, different groups are more likely to be in position in different roles in society, different jobs in society. And again, stereotypes derive from those roles. And ultimately, this is kind of argued that this is rooted a little bit in the fundamental attribution error as well. So when people see you in a specific job, we conclude that, oh, that person has that job, they're performing whatever task within that job, therefore they have those traits. And then I can take that categorization of whatever a woman at that particular job and then apply it to all women. And that is basically what it means, that stereotypes are functions of your historical context, your political and your economic and cultural context, because they act as social constraints. Again, literally women de facto basically banned from large prestigious universities, and as such, we're less likely to have an MD or something along those lines. You can also see this in like 18th century United States, for example. So in that context, African slaves who were imported from Africa are going to be overwhelmingly more likely to be slaves. So Africans in that context, in that 18th century United States, far more likely to be slaves. And then, so that's their role in society. That is their quote unquote job. And again, because they have that role, we're going to infer, we're going to believe that they have specific traits consistent with their job. So they are slaves because they are whatever, and then just characterize that person and then apply that to all Africans. So as such, the role that you have in society influences the stereotypes that develop, and those specific roles that are accessible to different groups are constrained by historical, political, economic, and cultural factors. is the interpretation of this origin of stereotypes. Okay, next we have the stereo content model. Adherents of this model argue that discrimination develops on the basis of how groups relate to each other on 2 dimensions. So stereotypes we have of different groups can range along 2 dimensions of competence and warmth, according to Fisk in 2002. As a result, we have different emotional reactions to different types of groups. Our kind of first dimension here is status. It's kind of going to be implicated in competence. But status, you have high/low status relative to other groups. High status brings about assumptions of competence, prestige, and power. In our other dimension is warmth. Kind of implicated here is cooperation. This seems to include likability, groups perceived as cooperative/helpful or competitive/harmful to other groups in a society. Cooperative/helpful groups are seen as warm and trustworthy, while competitive, harmful groups are seen as cold and conniving, according to a 2008 study. So basically, we have different groups, and different groups evaluate each other on these 2 dimensions, competence and warmth. I think you either, so comparing A and Z group, A group views Z group as low in stat or high in status, I should say. So therefore, they believe that Z group is like super competent, they have a lot of prestige, and they have a lot of power. However, at that same time, a group can also view Z group as not cooperative, okay? So yeah, they have a lot of status, they have a lot of competence and power, but at the same time, that group is cold, conniving, they're competitive, and they're harmful. So basically, we have these 2 dimensions, you can be high or low on it, and depending on where you fall, where different groups, how different groups evaluate each other, you get sorted into one of 4 quadrants. And those quadrants can be described as pity, pride, disgust, and envy. So for pity, they have high levels of warmth and low levels of confidence. And those can include elderly or disabled. Those stereotypes are going to be based around high levels of warmth and low levels of competence. Or you can have low levels of warmth and low levels of incompetence. So you are low in both dimensions, low warmth, low competence. In this case, the idea here, stereotypes are going to be centered around feelings of disgust. You do not like those people, or they have failed society in some way. They are screwing up. They're untrustworthy. They have little power, little prestige, and they're just kind of incompetent. And those can include, for example, stereotypes of homeless and drug addicts. Some critiques of this model include that it fails to capture other dimensions, such as perceptions of morality, and also groups may be stereotyped as high in competence in some domains, such as sports, and low in others, such as academics. So, for example, you can imagine one social group who has very good at academics and whatever, and they're believed to be very bad at sports. As such, depending on the domain in which competence is displayed, aka in the classroom or on the football field, there can be different stereotypes of that social groups, and thus challenging this model. There's not just one overall idea of competence, but rather there's competence in specific domains, and this 4-quadrant model does not capture that, is the critique of this model. So why do we apply stereotypes? Some scholars argue that stereotypes are cognitive tools for simplifying everyday life. Cognitively too difficult to interact with solely individual characteristics and behaviors. So therefore, we draw quick social inferences and conserve limited cognitive resources. So the argument here is, yes, we all like to be for me as a unique individual. It is impossible to do so. You cannot evaluate everyone's specifically based on their entire life history. We do not have the time to do so. We do not have the cognitive resources to do so. Therefore, our brains being lazy draw quick, simplified ways in which to categorize people, and stereotypes are one form of that. It is a cognitive tool for simplifying everyday lives. Also, stereotypes help justify violence, discrimination, dehumanization, infrahumanization, and sexual objectification against outgroups. People can be motivated to maintain beliefs to justify their prejudice. When a country declares war on another country, stereotypes of that country become more negative. According to the Justification Suppression model of prejudice, stereotypes provide people with supposedly acceptable explanations for having negative feelings about a group. If you believe all people from Sri Lanka, I should say, are rude, then a person can justify why they feel off-put by Sri Lankans, for example. Negative feelings sometimes comes first. Stereotypes make those feelings seem acceptable/rational. So we alluded to this before, but also what stereotypes allow is they provide a ways in which we can have an explanation for our negative attitudes about our group, about a particular group. So, for example, our Sri Lankan listeners out there, this is not a real example, but we are going to ride with it. So, Sri Lankans, if a person believes that all Sri Lankans are rude, then you all of a sudden feel justified in why you have prejudice against Sri Lankans. So you have kind of like empirical data. You have a worldview in which that allows you to justify your negative feelings, your attitudes, your behaviors, whatever it is, your beliefs towards Sri Lankans. You fundamentally believe that's who those people are. That group that has essential properties that make them rude, dangerous, whatever it is. And as such, you are correct in your stereotypes. You should feel that way about people. It's very similar kind of to that genetic discussion and that essentialist argument that we reviewed a few slides ago. Also, when a country declares war on another country, stereotypes of that country can become more negative. So you're literally killing each other, two countries, and therefore, in that context, stereotypes allow for justification of violence. Everybody in that culture and that group, those set of people are evil, they're whatever, and therefore they deserve violence to be enacted upon them. Now let's walk through some of those components, those justifications for violence discrimination in more detail, specifically with dehumanization. This is operationally defined as viewing an outgroup as less than fully human. Violent perpetrators are less inhibited about committing violence when an outgroup is reduced to animals. This allows for mistreatment, such as slavery, bombing, and genocide, according to a 2017 study. Catelli in 2015 found that hearing about acts of terrorism by Muslims against U.S., American, and British targets in 2013 was positively associated with bombing Muslim countries believed to have terrorists. Goff et al. In 2014 found that police officers who implicitly associated Black Americans with apes were more likely to have a record of using force against Black American children than other American children. When innocent people are killed, perpetrators of violence and those who do nothing to stop the violence reduce dissonance by regarding victims as subhuman. Sorolla in 2006 found that when people were made to feel a sense of collective responsibility for their in-group's mass killing of an outgroup, they viewed members of the outgroup as less than human. All right, so we have a lot here. Let's get some main points. So again, dehumanization. So you're decreasing the humanity of a person. You are saying they are not human. They are, in fact, animals. They are roaches. And then also in this viewpoint, the idea here is that we are not equal value with other forms of life. So humans are at the top, and then there's all the other animals, all right? So that's kind of built into dehumanization here. So thus, this other social group is not fully human. They are dogs. They are roaches, whatever it is, all right? So kind of the idea here is that they're not fully human. Therefore, it's not like you're really committing violence against another person. It's really, you're kind of just smashing a cockroach. You're killing a fly. You're punching a dog, or whatever. You believe you can kick a dog or something like that. And because they're not fully human, I'm less inhibited in my about committing violence. And it provides me with, again, further justification for severe collective mistreatment, violence, slavery, bombing, committing genocide against a group. They are not truly human. They can even be like some alien version of humanity that are only understand violence or something along those lines. They do not have the properties consistent with the proper human. And obviously, this is going to be subjectively defined. In this 2015 study of Catelli, basically measuring dehumanization of Muslims, kind of another marker of Islamophobia. Kind of the idea here is that when researchers are told U.S., American, and British participants Muslim terrorists, or terrorists who were Muslim, I should say, were attacked some kind of U.S. or British, whatever it is, some kind of target cultural system or symbol or something along those lines. In kind of that context, the participants dehumanize Muslims kind of across the board, and then were far more likely to bomb Muslim countries regardless of kind of a civilian toll. And then the Goff study, basically comparing Black Americans to apes, kind of dehumanizing here. So they're not fully human; they're a subhuman form or whatever, something along those lines. And kind of the idea, therefore, thus, it doesn't really matter if you kill the children, because Black children, because ultimately, again, they're not fully human. It gives you a justification to commit violence against other humans. You also see this with people who are in a country wherein maybe they know that their country is involved in some kind of mass atrocity, whatever, slavery, bombing, or committing genocide. And then the question is like, okay, well, what do you do about that? If you choose to do nothing about that, you have to resolve that cognitive dissonance, that kind of idea that, okay, you know that whatever, slavery, bombing, a genocide is happening in your country's committing slavery or bombing or committing genocide, but you're doing nothing to stop it. So how do you kind of resolve those two conflicting views? Because theoretically, you don't like both slavery and genocide. So one way you can do this is, again, just regard the victim as subhuman. So in that case, yeah, sure, there's genocide happening, there's slavery happening, there's bombing happening, but ultimately that group, that racial group, that religious group, that sexual minority group is not really human. Therefore, is it really a genocide is kind of the argument here. It's like, they're not fully human. Can you commit genocide against ants? I don't know, not really. I mean, who cares? It's kind of, again, you're viewing, implicit in this is that you have kind of different hierarchies of animals and they're whatever. So describing people in animalistic terms decreases their humanity and therefore allows kind of cruelty towards those subhuman people, thus allowing for genocide, for example. Next, we have infrahumanization. In this case here, this is described as a subtler form of dehumanization. This construct, people who use it do not compare outgroups directly to non-human animals. They perceive the outgroup members as lacking qualities viewed as being unique to humans. So hope, sympathy, and humiliation, for example. So in this group here, we have you have your own group, and you view your in-group, obviously, as possessing all things that make up humanity. So hope, sympathy, love, humiliation, whatever. However, the out-group, those kind of properties, those behaviors, those cognitions that are unique to humans, again, you're just going to assume within this kind of framework that only humans have these things. So you have your in-group has those things, but the out-group is whatever missing, some component of what makes humans special. That out-group lacks hope. They lack sympathy. They lack humiliation. In a 2007 study, these researchers found that the more participants humanize Hurricane Katrina victims, that is, they were less likely to feel remorse/mourning, the less likely they were to report they intended to help recovery. So again, kind of the idea here is that you can resolve that dissonance between, oh, there's a hurricane, it's very rad, bad shit happened, these people need help. Then you can question, okay, well, why were they in that position in the first place? What are the implications of this? Why am I not doing something about this? Well, boom, this is resolved by just saying that outgroup, yeah, they're human-ish, but they also kind of lack the ability to feel remorse or mourning. Therefore, the devastation that's happening to them, it's going to qualitatively affect them differently than I would. Therefore, they're going to be fine, and I'm going to be okay with my inaction to help those hurricane victims. And you can also, imagine this in a bombing scenario or slavery or genocide as well or something like that. Like those people only know violence. Those people don't feel sympathy for their death or mourning. They don't feel the mourning for their family or friends or whatever who died in this bombing or genocide or slavery campaign. So therefore, I am good with not helping them out. We can also apply stereotypes for sexual objectification. This is operationally defined as the tendency to think about people in a narrow way as objects rather than as full humans, as if their physical appearances were all that matters. This is more likely among women than men. Researchers in 1997 argued that this is a way to deny women possess psychological characteristics that make them fully human, such as points of view and complex cognition. Researchers have found that well-known women, but not men, were perceived more like objects, such as cold, incompetent, immoral, when participants were asked to focus on women's appearance than when they were asked to focus on women as people. So here we have this idea that you're reducing a group of people to objects. And specifically, in women, this usually takes the form of just their physical appearance. So sexual objectification. So the idea here is not that, or I should say that there's never any like sexual evaluation of each other. Humans are sexual beings. There is going to be attractiveness evaluations of each other. However, in this case, this specific group reduced to only objectification, only kind of sexual evaluations. That's all they are. So it's not a part of being a package of being a human, but rather the only thing that they are. And as stated, much more likely among women than men. And because they are objects and they are all that matters is kind of their physical appearance, you have to kind of what kind of gets wrapped up in this is that ultimately women do not possess different points of view and kind of like full complex cognition that full, quote unquote, full humans would have. Again, kind of another version of kind of subhumanity. But in this case here, we're emphasizing physical attributes only. And to do so, we justify that by saying that, that's all women really have. They don't have these, whatever. They can't be a doctor or something along those lines. And this in return can kind of justify different kind of a gender power balances within a given society, and also kind of sexist like interpersonal behavior as well. Because again, a woman is only just this object. They maybe can't even like process sexism or something like that. Therefore, you are justified in your behavior / specifically sexual objectification. Stereotypes also allow us to justify the status quo. Stereotypes are often ambivalent, including positive and negative traits. High status groups that are assumed to be competent are more likely to be stereotyped as cold, while lower status groups who are stereotyped as being less intelligent are more likely to be stereotyped as warm and friendly. This brings about the social justification theory, which argues that ambivalent stereotypes help maintain the status quo by justifying the way things are. We believe people should be in specific social roles because they have the traits that are needed for those roles. Theorists argue that those who are in high status in society will view those in lower status as being less intelligent / industrious than their own group to justify their own superior economic position. If high status groups did not have this justification, they would have to admit injustices exist, which should be rectified, which would alter the status quo and thus lose their advanced position in society. So as stated, stereotypes are often ambivalent. So whatever, this high status group, you can be like, oh man, they got a lot of money, but damn, they're so cold and calculated. Maybe they're even a little bit sad inside, but they are also wealthy. And then you have the lower status group who's like, okay, well, listen, they're probably dumber than us. They are less like hardworking or something like that. But you know what? Everybody there in that group is just so nice and friendly. So again, you have like this combination of positive and negative traits within these stereotypes. And then the social justification theory basically argues that the ambivalent nature of stereotypes allow status quos to be justified and thus kind of be legitimate and kind of persevere through time. Consistent with the social role theory, this idea that people are in certain roles, certain jobs in society because they have specific traits, certain essential properties to them that places them in that role. So their place in society, their role in society is justified because they have those specific traits as a group. So because there are specific roles that exist, and those specific roles and jobs are going to exist within a hierarchy of class and whatever social prestige or something along those lines, the people at the top who are at high status in society are going to be more likely to view those in lower status in society as whatever, less intelligent than them, less hardworking than them, because you need that to justify your position in society. Because ultimately, you are aware that there is kind of a hierarchy, there's some kind of differences that can be representative in like wealth, social prestige, maybe violence committed against people, discrimination, whatever it is. You're at the top of the class of society. And then the question is like, well, why? Why are you at the top and not other people? And well, kind of what these theorists argue is that these stereotypes allow people to justify where they are. So I'm at the top of the, I'm very, very wealthy because I earned it. I'm the smartest person ever. I'm the modern day genius. My traits are being, rewarded by society. And that's why I'm there. And conversely, those people at the bottom, they are lacking some specific traits. They are dumber than me. They don't work harder than me, whatever it is. But you have to have kind of that justification. Or if you don't have that justification, then the question is like, why do these injustices exist? Why are you at the top and not other people? And if you came to the conclusion there is no justification, then the status quo is illegitimate. Your position in society is illegitimate, and therefore theoretically you have to do something about it, or you're just going to feel like shit. You're going to feel worse about it. So this kind of justification allows for inaction and kind of a more, I guess, or a higher sense of well-being for people in different positions in society. Now that's for people at the high end of society. You have a lot of wealth. You're smarter than everybody else. You work harder than everybody else. And then people at the bottom are dumber again, and whatever. They don't work as hard as you, and you've earned your place in society. Society is gifting you with your just rewards. However, at the same time, this lower status groups can also justify the current status quo. So by favoring ambivalent stereotypes, groups that are disadvantaged in terms of status in society can still pride themselves on their warmth. They can hold on to the positive and negative stereotype. They can hold on to the positive aspects of stereotypes, and thus the negative stereotypes don't feel as bad. Groups with power/status can decrease by acknowledging the warmth of those with lower status. So in this case here, you have the lowest status group, and you're looking around, you're like, damn, I'm kind of poor, or whatever. Society does not value my group, or we're actively discriminated against. But at the very least, I still am warm. We are still very friendly and nice or cool or whatever it is. And I can take pride in that. So therefore, you're not people in the lower status group, according to the social justification theorists, are now not challenging the status quo. They're accepting the status quo and kind of taking solace in the fact that they are warm people. They're taking solace in the facts, the quote unquote facts of the positive aspects of their stereotype. As such, not directly challenging the status quo and giving them kind of a reason not to do so. And at the same time, the people at the higher, wealthier people, higher classes, social and economic classes, can decrease kind of that feeling of uneasiness by saying, like, listen, hey, at the very least, those people at the bottom of the ladder, at least they're all friendly. They're so happy. Therefore, it's not that bad. It's all good. They like it. And now my position in society is justified. They like it. I like it. It's all good. I don't have to challenge the status quo. There's also ambivalent sexism. Pairs hostile beliefs about women, that is, that they are incompetent or they're tryhards for equality, with benevolent beliefs, such as they're pure, compassionate more than men. Reminders of benevolent sexism associated with increase in likelihood of support for status quo. So here, similarly for women, we have these kind of two ambivalent sexist stereotypes. And what Becker and Wright found in 2011 was that when you prime women participants with the stereotypical belief of hostile attitudes, that is this idea that they're going to, women try hard for the equality or something along those lines, and granted also incompetent. The important thing about stereotypes, they don't necessarily have to make sense. They can be contradictory. But anyway, so when you prime women with hostile beliefs about their hostility, they are more likely to endorse beliefs that they are going to fight for like equality or something like that. While women participants who were primed benevolent beliefs, that is, that they're pure, they're compassionate, kind of like the fragile kind of like woman thing who just wants to be, like tidy and not really rock the boat kind of thing. When women participants were primed with that benevolent sexism, when they were more likely to endorse the status quo. So you can possibly interpret this as like women who, again, primed for this benevolent belief stereotype. They're pure, they're compassionate. Therefore, they don't really want to rock the boat. They don't want to engage into the messy struggle of like whatever political struggle or whatever policy or whatever it is, cultural change. Rather, they feel good about themselves and are thus because they have these benevolent properties that men do not have. I have something that a man doesn't have, and therefore, it's all good. At least I have this. So kind of similar with kind of a lower class people kind of saying, oh, at least we're really friendly. In this case here, at least I have something men don't have. I am proper. I am pure. I'm compassionate. That is something to pride myself in. And therefore, it's all good. I don't have to challenge the status quo. And in fact, the status quo might be justified. Next, self-esteem. Viewing members of the outgroup as stupid, lazy, immoral can help people feel better about themselves. So you can say, you know what, I'm having rough times, but at least I'm not that outgroup because they are pieces of trash, and I do not want to be them. However, people belong to different social categories. Motivation can influence how people socially categorize. White Canadian participants imagine receiving praise or criticism from a Black Canadian or white Canadian doctor. Participants who were praised by the Black doctor activated positive stereotypes of doctors, but not negative stereotypes of Black people. Participants criticized by Black doctors activated negative stereotypes about Black people, but not positive doctor stereotypes, according to a 1999 study. So our own self-motivation can influence how we socially categorize people, because we all belong to multiple social categories. So in the case of Black doctors, just kind of, this is not correct, but just reducing it to two categories, being a Black Black Canadian, and then being a doctor. So we have two sets of stereotypes for both. In this case here, when white Canadian participants were praised by the Black doctor, they activated their positive stereotypes of doctors. So whatever it is, they're smart and they're caring and they're helpful or whatever it is. But however, they do not activate negative stereotypes about Black people. So in that case there, you're activating the stereotype of a doctor. However, when white Canadian participants are criticized, now the participants activated the negative stereotypes about Black people, however, not the positive doctor stereotype. So again, representing that people belong to different social categories, and depending on our self-motivation at time, we can sort people in different social categories to either have a positive or negative evaluation of that person/group. When stereotypes are activated, they can influence a person's judgments or behavior. So, for example, although student evaluations of male and female instructors are equivalent among students who perform well, students who receive a lower grade rate female instructors as less competent than male instructors. This is a quite common finding, and among many reasons why using student evaluations or putting a lot of weight into them is highly questionable. Women instructors, again, routinely find that they get lower ratings among lower grade or students who receive lower grades. You also see this with the race of the instructor as well. So here we activate a stereotype about that the instructor, instead of an instructor stereotype, we activate a woman's stereotype among students who perform lower. So whatever, women, they shouldn't be teaching, they shouldn't be in this position to teach over me. Therefore, I'm going to negatively judge them or write a bad review about that woman instructor. In our final topic, we are going to talk about shooter bias, again, a way to measure stereotypes and kind of the real-world consequences of stereotypes. This is the shooter bias. Kernel in 2022 had white American participants play a video game in which they were shown photographs of Black and white American men holding an object and were asked to press the, quote, shoot button if the individual was holding a gun, and, quote, don't shoot button if the individual was not holding a gun. Participants were likely to shoot an unarmed Black man than a unarmed white man. The authors argued that the effects resulted more from the individual's knowledge of cultural stereotypes, that Black Americans are more dangerous than from personal prejudice. In a follow-up study, these researchers found that Black American participants showed similar shooter bias towards Black American men holding an object. So here again, we have an attempt to measure the impact of stereotypes of a particular racial group, in this case here, or any group, I should say, but in this case here, a cultural stereotype of Black Americans, and a common stereotype is that they are more dangerous. And what the researchers want to do is make your decision as quickly as possible. Either press the shoot button or the don't shoot button. And as stated, white participants and subsequently Black American participants were more likely to shoot an unarmed Black American man than an unarmed white man. And these researchers used kind of the systems-oriented interpretation and the cultural perspective to interpret this behavior, wherein participants have an understanding of the cultural stereotypes of a group and will act, and thus stereotypes and prejudices will come from that understanding, and those understandings are kind of rooted in some kind of institutional racial biases in this case. As such, both sets of participants in this study, both Black and white Americans, were more likely to adhere or show behavior consistent with the belief that Black Americans were more dangerous, aka more likely to press the shoot button for unarmed Black men. Researchers also found in subsequent studies that the context matters. So the participants were far more likely to shoot an unarmed Black man in a context of like an outside street at night or something like that versus being in a church, for example. So again, a real-world application of the real life life and death consequences of stereotypes. All right, everyone. With that said, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next week. Bye.